Hello and welcome to the Freakish Lemon video podcast. I am your host, the Freakish Lemon. I go by Adrian and I use masculine pronouns. Welcome to any new viewers. Thank you so much for clicking on whatever you clicked on to get here. And welcome back any returning viewers. Thanks for following along with this thing that I do. This is a crafty type podcast coming to you from the Northwest Hills of Connecticut, and you can find show notes for this episode and all episodes at freakishlemon.com or freakishlemonpodcast.com that go to the same place. We also have a group on Ravelry. Just search Freakish Lemon in the Groups tab and you will find us, and you can follow me at all the fun places as Freakish Lemon, like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. All the links to all these fun things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. And if you are here on YouTube and you want to follow along with what I'm doing, consider hitting that subscribe button down there so that you know when I post new videos. Alright, scroll down my show notes, please. It would help if I turned on the little keyboard. There we go. Podcast stuff. We have two make-alongs currently ongoing. The Blanket 2018, or the 2018 Blanket Make-Along, which is going on in a group in a thread in our Ravelry group. Just if you're working on a blanket of any kind, any craft, feel free to come share some encouragement and post, and we like to see photos of what everybody's working on, so come join us over there. And also currently we have the Half Square Triangle Quilt Along, which will be going until the end of September. There's all the stuff you need to know is in a thread in the group on Ravelry. Consider joining us if you want to get into any quilting, or if you are a quilter and you're working on anything that has half square triangles. That's really it for podcasts. Oh, one more thing that I mentioned. I just noticed, like today, that people are prepping and working on Tour de Fleece spinning. Usually, or at least this time last year, I had started Sith and Spin to coincide with Tour de Fleece, and that clearly didn't really happen this year. I don't know if I want to put on Sith and Spin this year, just because I feel like any months past this, like anything later than August, tends to be kind of swallowed up by festival and event season and then holiday seasons. So I don't know if we're gonna have a 2018 Sith and Spin. But if you guys really want to do a Sith and Spin, just let me know and I'll throw up a thread in the group, and we'll spin and watch, listen, read, whatever, some Star Wars things, because it's kind of become an annual tradition. So just let me know if anybody's interested, and if enough people are interested, I'll post something. Of course, the hashtag Sith and Spin is available for use at any point you are spinning and enjoying Star Wars entertainment. That's what it's there for. But just thought I'd mention it since spinning has been in my feed a lot recently. Which moves us on to a little bit of life stuff. Two things real quick. I did participate in the I-91 Shop Hop, which is an 11-store yarn crawl taking place along the I-91 corridor from, I think it's Branford, Connecticut, up to Putney, Vermont. Yep, I went with Mom and Gabby from the Once Upon a Corgi podcast, who is my sister, and we had a really good time. Although we did notice that we hit some serious yarn store fatigue by day 3. Like, you just hit a point where you're like, I have seen all the yarn in the world, and while I love it, I would like to take a nap instead. But it was a good time, and it's a nice little mini vacation around a time where there's not really a lot of other fiber type events happening. And I will talk about the things I acquired later in the new stuff segment. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was a bit of a hand update. I had talked about doing some occupational therapy for hand strengthening exercises and nerve stretches, but while they did help, didn't make the pain go away, and at the suggestion of my occupational therapist, I went to go see a different doctor. The doctor that I was seeing was a general orthopedic doctor, so he's not a hand specialist. She recommended a hand specialist. I went to go see him, and he gave me an answer as to why there's inflammation in my nerves. And it's something that, when I talked to my occupational therapist on the last appointment that I had with her, is not something that people think about when they hear hand and wrist pain. This kind of pain usually points people to carpal tunnel syndrome. What the new hand specialist doctor told me is that I have double jointed wrists, and that means that my joints in my wrists, they stretch further than an average person's joints stretch. And one of the side effects of that is when my hands are in a flat position where you're supposed to be holding your wrist straight, the carpals in my wrist are a little looser than other people's, which means if I'm in that position for a long time, the carpals can shift and just kind of like touch that nerve, that just in there, in the carpal, they'll just touch it. And that's what's causing the inflammation, is my wrist bones don't want to stay where they're supposed to. It's not like an extreme shift, it's just they're shifting a little bit, enough to rub up against that nerve and cause some inflammation. He told me that if I was not working in an office job, if I did a different job where I moved my hands a lot more, or if I had a greater variety of hand activity during my workday, then I probably would never have shown symptoms of this. But because I'm on the computer all day, the way so many of us are, that's how the double jointedness decided to make itself known, by causing inflammation in my wrists. So that's good. I mean, it's not great, but it's not carpal tunnel syndrome, which could have been a problem. And we can deal with what is causing the inflammation, which was my problem with the previous doctor, because he didn't know what was causing the inflammation. And this guy says, this is what's causing the inflammation. So even if he's wrong, at least I have an answer. An answer to work from, which is great. But that's enough about my hands. There's not much else going on in my life because I am a boring person who does the same things every day. So let's jump into some actual crafty goodness, starting with FOs. And since it's been a month, and I've kind of been working on a variety of things, I have a whole bunch of finished objects. So this is exciting, but don't expect it in these monthly updates. I think I just got real excited about some stuff and just finished it. It also helps that some of these things are small projects. So the first two things I want to talk about are tuck stitch hats. I don't have it with me, but in my previous episode I showed you a hat that I made using a tuck stitch pattern on my LK150 knitting machine using 100 Ravens yarn in the Draco colorway. And I had said that the brim of that hat was a little bit tight because I was using a mock rib, which is not as stretchy as regular rib, in the tension below. So what I did was I did up a swatch with a fingering weight yarn held double, And this is Once Upon a Corgi's Snow Scout from the Series of Unfortunate Events Club colorways. In the same tuck stitch pattern. I reworked my numbers and I got myself a fingering weight held double pattern, and I made a second hat. So this is basically identical to the Draco hat, except I did the mock rib hung hem brim in the same dial tension as the main body, which I believe was dial 6. So, finished that hat, and like the other hat, it's pretty snug on there. It's a good, like, layer up because it's real cold outside, but it's not pulling in as much here at the brim. As I was finishing up this hat, I had a hypothesis about the brim and the snugness factor. So I grabbed another skein of fingering weight yarn, also Once Upon a Corgi. This is the You Are In Fact in the Dark, also a Series of Unfortunate Events Club colorway. And again, I did the same tuck stitch pattern. This camera is kind of blowing it out a bit. It's a lot clearer to see the pattern in real life because it's a lot darker. But this is just a regular stockinette hung hem. And I did that because the tuck stitch, the way tuck stitch works is it kind of like compresses your knitting and it kind of spreads it out a little bit horizontally. So regular stockinette stitch is actually slightly narrower than a tuck stitch. So I just did a regular stockinette stitch hung hem, and this fits much better. You can see there's a lot of stretch in the hem, more so than the other hats. Now I still need to tweak my machine knit kind of hat patterns to get something a little bit less snug than this for times when I want a hat that's a little less snug. But I'm very, very pleased with all 3 of these hats that I made, and I really did enjoy the decreases. I did show you on the Draco hat, but it's an 8-stitch decrease at 4 points. So there's a center double decrease at 4 points on this hat, which is a lot easier to keep track of on a knitting machine because it's really clear to see even from the purl side. Sometimes it's harder to read decreases purl side if it's just a knit 2 together, whereas the center double decrease you can really see the really thick purl bump. Probably not on camera, but there's a really thick purl bump that's pretty easy to see when this is, you know, flat and weighted down. So that's 2 hats I have finished. And then I finished another machine knit project. This is the first project to come off of my Brother KH836E knitting machine, which is the knitting machine that I was restoring. It's a shawl for my Shawl Shapes project. I've done one of these before, but this is my Ace shawl. It's an asymmetrical shawl. And it looks gray on my camera here, but it's actually kind of a blue-gray, like a washed-out denim color. And this is in Zilana Performa Kiwi Lace in the blue colorway. Oh, I forgot to save a tag, but this is a yarn that has a percentage of wool, I think a percentage of cotton, and a percentage of possum. I'm not too sure about the cotton, but I know there's wool and I know there's possum. It's very soft, it's very lightweight, and I did not write down in my notes what gauge I did this on, but I want to say I did this in either an 8 or a 10 on the gauge dial on the carriage of the knitting machine. I used 3 balls of this yarn, which I had gotten years ago at a sidewalk sale at my local yarn store, and I'm very pleased with how this turned out. It's a pretty plain shawl. These shawl-shaped projects are mostly going to be fairly plain, maybe with stripes, maybe with a smidge of other types of color work, but I mean, it's a lovely piece of knitwear. I like how just drapey and translucent this is. This is very light, so definitely kind of can go into the warmer seasons a bit more than my other shawls, which is fantastic. And if you go over to my Instagram, I posted a few photos the other day of this shawl out in the wild for my project page, and because I have 2 samples of this shawl, I now have, I think, enough notes that I can write up this pattern, which is great. 1 down, a few more to go. But this is a pretty cool project as a first shawl on the knitting machine. So figured that would be the first project off of that knitting machine. Next on the list, I have finished some scrap yarn dryer balls. This is actually a combination finished object and works in progress. Oops, dropped a bunch of stuff. Hang on. Because this is going to be an ongoing project. Here are 2 of the finished ones. I have about 5 now. And you can see by the colors on here that these were knit. I used my Addy Express Professional plastic circular knitting machine to knit little tubes that can be cinched at each end. I think it's like 22 rows. I have a couple of these gray ones out of a chunky gray wool that I had left over. I think I had maybe 50 grams of it left over, and I don't really use bulky or chunky weight yarns too much. And then this is a worsted weight held with a sport weight. This purple is actually from the cone of waste yarn that I use on my LK150. Which is why this is going to be an ongoing project, because the term waste yarn was just bugging me the wrong way, because it's not necessarily junk yarn, it's just yarn that's not a part of your project. But because of how much waste yarn you use with machine knitting, it's a pain to have to unravel it and then keep using it. Can't always judge how much waste yarn you're gonna need. It's a mess. So I decided that my waste yarn, which I have in a sport weight purple for my LK150 and a lace weight in bright orange for my brother machine, I will use the waste yarn for these like felted dryer balls or felted something projects. So 3 strands gets a bulky weight, and here's one that's completely stuffed with, there's another ball in here because I did one in just a worsted weight and it was not tight enough. But what I'm doing is I'm stuffing it with yarn clippings. Also, since I've started weaving, you end up with a lot of loom waste, is what they call it. When you're warping your loom, there's gonna be at least 3 inches or more, could be up to a foot depending on your project, of warp that you don't end up using. If you're not doing a fringe on your project, a lot of that is going to get cut off. and often it's too short to weave anything with later. So I'm just gonna stuff these little pouches, which look like this when they come off the Addy. I just cinch the one side and whip stitch it closed, and then this is actually the cast on edge, doing an every other needle cast on, and that'll cinch closed too. So I can stuff them full of yarn scraps. Like I said, I have about 5 of these. I've been saving my yarn scraps for a while to see if there was anything I could do with them. And then just felt them. So a bunch of these are going to go to my sister Gabby, who needs some more dryer balls. So that's great. I'm also going to be kind of recovering my dryer balls. The dryer balls that I have were made using Lion brand fisherman's wool, but I just rolled them up into a ball and felted them. So sometimes the individual strands pull away if it gets caught in the dryer, or if, you know, like gets caught on a zipper or something. So I'm gonna cover them up with these, excuse me notes, don't fall asleep, with these little pouches, and just kind of pad them with yarn cuttings as I go. So both a finished object and an ongoing project, but you're not likely to see them on the podcast after this episode, unless they come up later. So, dryer balls. So the next thing I finished was 3 sewing projects, which I showed you them in various states of completion in the previous episode, and those were the quilted dust covers for my knitting machines. And there's video showing here of what those dust covers look like now that they're finished and in my craft room on my knitting machines. So that's what they look like. And I talk more about how I put them together in my previous episode, so I won't go into it again here. But they are done, and they do work, and I'm very pleased to have them because there's been a lot of fiber flying around for various crafts, and it really makes it a lot easier to dust in there knowing that the dust isn't going to get stuck in my machines. So that works for me. And then I finished a weaving project. I had been working on this one for a while. I finished it shortly after the last episode, but this is my last Son of Krypton scarf. The warp is in 3 fingering weight wools, a dark blue, a medium blue, and a red in this kind of stripe pattern. Let's see, can you see the... It's kind of hard to tell the different color blues, but I did do a twisted fringe, so you can see there's different colors of blues in there. I did the medium blue kind of in the middle of the dark blue. I used the 12 dent heddle on my 10-inch shocked Cricut loom, and the weft is some very, very old handspun of mine that I called the last Son of Krypton back when I was trying to sell it on Etsy. I still have about 76 grams, I think, of this yarn left. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it, but I'm gonna reskein it and put it back in stash for a while. I was hoping to use up pretty much all of it in this scarf, but that is not the case. Yeah, so it's a pretty long scarf because I like my scarves long, so that if I do this, it's down to at least mid-thigh. This way I can either wear it long or choke myself, apparently. If I need to, wrap it a few times around and tuck it into my coat. And yes, this was an interesting project to do because I was working with hand spun, that I became very aware of what my selvages were doing, because even though it doesn't look like it's even, let me see if I can focus that up, because of the nature of hand spun, it did make me pay attention to what my selvages were doing. Like this one, you can see I was pulling too tight in a bit, and then not enough, and then too tight again. So I'm definitely improving with my selvages, and I really do like how these twisted fringes turned out. I'm a little bit sad that I didn't do them on that blanket project, which I still could if I really wanted to, but it's just so many ends. So this many ends is a lot more manageable. I can do them in an evening. And I have one of those little twister doohickeys where it's just a couple of alligator clips and a couple of little boards, and you just crank them around to twist. And I did hem stitch this at the bottom in the dark blue. Overall, very pleased with how this scarf turned out. And then I have one more finished object, which I finished yesterday. And that is my scarfy sweater blank sweater. So the sweater blank, as I've said before in previous episodes, if you want to get into huge details then, there is a pattern by Renee Callahan. She has a Craftsy class on how to make a sweater using the sweater blank. It's made for machine knitting, but you can hand knit it if you want. So here's the original swatch that I decided I wanted to go with. And last time you saw this, I had about a third of the back on the machine. And once I sat down and got into the rhythm of it, I completed the other 3 pieces in a single weekend. It was especially quick because there was no outright hand manipulation of stitches except for decreases, so I didn't have to reform the ribbing. Everything is done with a hung hem. Oops, I didn't trim those ends. Everything is done with a hung hem, so it's stockinette up here, stockinette up here. The whole thing is stockinette, and I am very pleased with how this sweater turned out. Here is the front of the sweater. You can see I marled it so that there's kind of a striping effect. I mean, there's definitely a striping effect. And it looks really, really stark on the camera. It's not that stark because the white never quite gets white. It's always a little bit gray. So here's the front. Here is a sleeve. Here is a sleeve. This is a drop shoulder construction, so there's no shoulder shaping in any way. And this is the back of the sweater. The back is 2 inches longer than the front of the sweater, because that was something that I was noticing in my previous sweater blank sweater, that the back kind of crept up a little bit more than I liked. So I added a couple of inches, and because this is all stripy, I did a high-low hem, a split hem, because you would have been able to see any short rows in this the way I had these yarns. And then for the collar, I just did a rolled hem, because that's really the easiest thing to do on the machine. And I wanted this sweater to be done. I figured this doesn't really need a thick hung hem neckline, and I didn't want to reform for ribbing, so I just did a rolled neck, about 8 rows. And yeah, This is the one where I actually did a bit of a Frankensteining the math on the sweater blank. I did the size large because that fits me really well, but the large neck was a little too big for what I liked. This neck, as you can see, like comparing it to the neck of my t-shirt, is a lot closer to this size. It probably, I did try this on yesterday when I finished it, but it comes probably, if I was wearing this shirt underneath it, it would probably come to around here, which is a lot closer to what I was aiming for. So I am very pleased with how this sweater turned out. It's extremely warm. I used the Lion brand Scarfie. I think I have 2.5 skeins of that left, so I'm probably just gonna do like a big shawl scarf thing with the rest of it, just to bust it out of stash, since I don't have anything else that it would go with. And the lawnmower's coming around. So I'm sorry if you can hear that. But this is done, and I'm going to do one more sweater blank sweater that's definitely in the works. Doing a fingering weight. I want to do that on the Brother machine with some yarn that I've got picked out, using the same alterations, so it's more like of a shirt collar instead of something that comes down further. So I'm very pleased with that. Which brings us on to works in progress, which is probably a relief considering all the things that I finished. I have very few works in progress to talk about. I've got 5 bullet points. So the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is my granny striped blanket. This is using the pattern by Lucy of Attic 24. It's on a size G hook, which is a 4.2 millimeter hook, and I'm using Knit Pick Stroll Fingering marled with mini skeins, and I have put in a little bit of time on this. So that's what it looks like at this point. That little iced bun is where I was last time when I showed it to you. So this is going to be a kind of slow and steady until I can get the inflammation in my wrists consistently down. But I am working on this, and my hands do not hurt while I'm working on it, so that's good. But I am pacing myself just so it doesn't aggravate any inflammation. So I've also picked up a knitting project that I still had on the needles. When I hurt my hands and it was pretty clear that it wasn't going away within a week or two, I did an overhaul of my knitting works in progress, and I frogged a whole bunch of things. And this project bag, which is my Avengers project bag, it got put away with stash for my Shawl Shapes project because I was going to use some of this yarn for it, but I never actually took the needles out of the project. I'm glad that I didn't, because it's probably the best project that I could do to get my hands used to knitting again. And this is my Marled Magic shawl, which is a pattern by Stephen West. And I say it's probably the best to get my hands back into knitting again, because it's relatively small sections of different types of stitches. So there's a lot of different hand movements that go along with this. It's kind of a mess because I've got the I've got multiple cables in it. So this is the first section, which I had finished months ago. And you can see I've got a cable in there. And this is the siege stitch section, which when I stopped knitting on it, I was there. And I've done the rest of this since my last episode. Maybe a little bit before then, but not terribly much, doing 1 repeat of the 4 rows or 2 repeats of the 4 rows at a time. So that's what that's looking like. Again, it's really blown out with these lights. This is closer to real life, and I'm basically marling old hand spun with either commercial yarns or newer hand spun that's more consistent. This kind of blue to orange is a different hand spun. That's with this kind of purpley gray. In this section I've got a very, very old green. This is some of my very first hand spun, and it is thick and thin and over twisted and under plied and all over the place, and that's with a self-striping yarn up until the last couple of rows where I switched to another, actually I think it's some Once Upon a Corgi, but it's not a color that was ever released. This is the Teeth, which is a color that Gabby did for me for my Attack the Socks pattern, because I really wanted a specific color, and I think when I released the sock pattern she was in the middle of doing her own thing. But this is the Teeth. I have a ton of this left, so some of that is going into this shawl. So trucking along steadily on, oops, wrong side. Trucking along steadily on this. I'm a little bit past the halfway point for the seed stitch portion of the shawl. So it's definitely something that's easy to pick up and put down, and something that's not going to, I'm not going to get halfway through it and just like lose my mind with how slow it's going, because there's a lot of different pieces to the shawl. That's my hope anyway. I also just took a piece of weaving off the loom, but it's not finished yet. This is for a rectangular pillow, because I do still have a lot of small fabric scraps and a ton of polyester fiber fill from back when I made stuffies all the time. So I warped my loom with 108 inches of fingering weight yarns for the full breadth of the 12 dent heddle, except for the very ends. And I wove this big scrap yarn thing using mostly scrap yarns from other knitting projects, but also a couple of minis and just some leftovers. Like this weft is some of the leftovers from the scraps that Gabby gave me for the weaving sample for her booth, and there's a lot of leftovers from the 2 hats that I made. Like this is You Are In Fact in the Dark. That's just a white. This is Snow Scout. But a lot of blues and reds, yellows and greens. Stuff that was all kind of jarring next to each other, but weaving tends to mute colors a bit. That's kind of hard to tell on the camera because of the way the camera balances light, but I really like how this turned out. And what I will do is I will stabilize each end, because I just basically scrapped it off with this blue that's held double so I can see exactly where it is. I'm going to secure each end with a zigzag stitch or some kind of overlocking stitch on my sewing machine, then find the midpoint, stabilize either side of a cut line, cut it, and then stitch the 2 lengths together with probably a 1/4 inch, maybe a 3/8 inch seam, press them open and then divide them in half again so that or just fold them, so that I have a rectangle pillow. So all the weaving is done. It has been washed, but I do have to press it flat, secure the ends, and do the sewing part of the pillow, so it's not completely finished yet. But I'm really enjoying weaving panels and sewing them into things. Like those 2 round pillows that I made have ended up in my bedroom instead of in the craft room because I changed some things around in there. And I really like how they feel. So having a rectangular pillow that I can just throw on my bed will be really, really nice. And then I have done some spinning. I opened up this tote bag, Gender Roles Are Dead, to work on some of the last alpaca that I have. This is from Alpaca Obsession. And it's this kind of light tawny brown. And I had found that I had done a bunch of spinning on this, and I don't know when I did it, but I did. This was nearly full when I pulled it out. So I've got this spindle full, and I have another turtle. So I have probably a quarter of it left to spin, between a quarter and a third. And that'll be all the yarn spun for my alpaca shawl project. That's all hand spun, so that's very exciting. But that's just been kind of picked up here and there. Another thing I've been picking up here and there is my brown Cormo sweater spin. Just a quick 5 to 15 minutes on the wheel every couple of days or so, just to get some time in. This was more than half full when my hands started hurting, so just taking it a little bit at a time, because this is a worsted spin, so I am squeezing the air out of the wool as I feed it into the orifice for the spinning wheel, so that is a little more hand intensive. So a little bit of progress on that. And then I started a Classy Squid Fiber Company bat. This is the Star Fishing Bat, and this is half of it. I was doing this one long draw since that's easier on my hands, and it's also quicker, especially if you don't care about consistency, which I don't with the Classy Squid Fiber Company bats because they're very textured. So I just kind of let the yarn do what it wants. And this is half of the bat, which is very exciting. Because at some point I'm gonna fill up all these normal size bobbins and then have a plying party with the big bobbins. So that's exciting. And that's it for works in progress. So just real quick, a bunch of swatches, since I do have a swatch section of my podcast. You do a lot of swatching and machine knitting if you were not aware of that. So I got my Brother KH836E up and running, which of course you saw because I finished something on it, but I did do a whole bunch of swatches on that machine. This is a swatch that I did with, I did short rows, I did some slip stitches, I did the alternating tuck stitch pattern that I used in the hat, and some hand manipulated eye-hole lace, just kind of manually on the machine using the manual hold button the same way I would on the LK150, just to make sure that things were working. I could get yarn on it and off it and cast on, cast off, all the basic stuff. And then tried a punch card. I tried punch card number 2. And I did slip stitches and tuck stitches. So here's the, which ones did I do first? Hang on. That should be a little bit better. Yeah, Dad had to mow right under the window just there. So the first one is the slip using the part buttons on the carriage, and this is the tuck using the tuck buttons on the carriage. And the cool thing about the punch card is, you know, you feed your punch card into the little thing and it will automatically select the needles for you. So this was punch card number 2. Yes, which I think that's the one that has every other punched out for 2 rows and then the alternating ones punched out for 2 rows. So it automatically selects it, it automatically does all that for you if it's working properly, which it did for the tuck and slip. And then, yeah, I took that same one and I did some 2-color slip and some 2-color tuck, which, because of the way I was alternating the colors, just kind of, especially for the tuck, because the way I was altering the colors, it just kind of became bars of color changes. But it was an experiment, and this is with manually taking the color out after every 2 rows. And then, because another thing you can do with the punch cards is Fair Isle or 2-color color work. So I have this big color work swatch, and so this was punch card number 3, which has kind of a plus sign motif. And you can see here in this very first section here that it was not working. And I have these super long floats in the back. And that's because the levers were working while the carriage passed one way and not the other. So the second color wasn't catching. So I took the carriage off and I cleaned it up some more. I found a lever that I hadn't lubricated and it wasn't moving, so I fixed that up. Did a bunch of hold rows of row 1 basically, just to make sure that the color was catching every single time, which it did. And then I turned my show notes back on. I did this section using the punch card. And it's kind of hard to see because I did variegated colors for both of them, but you can see it a little bit there. There's kind of a plus sign motif. And another thing that you can do with the punch cards is you can set it to long. There's kind of a regular triangle and a long triangle, in which case it will do every row twice. So I elongated it out, and that's what that looks like. And you can see once I lubricated the machine up, there was no problem with the floats at all. After that, everything catches nicely, and it's really kind of effortless 2-color color work because the machine does all of it for you, which is incredible. I'm really looking forward to, at some point, doing an all-over color work sweater in something like this, with a small color motif, maybe a scrap sweater with scrap yarns so that it kind of blends nicely. That would be super cool. And also, since my last podcast, I have managed to do some basic cleaning and hook up the ribber bed for my Brother machine, the KR850, and I threw some of my my bright orange lace weight scrap yarn on there and played around with some ribbing. So this is kind of hard to see because of how blown out it is. And I did this at kind of a big tension just so I could see what I was doing. But here is some basic ribbing. Another thing you can do is you can do circular knitting when you have a ribber. So it's a little hard to show you but this section is just a tube. You can also do what they call U-shaped knitting, which is very similar to the circular knitting, but one end is open and the other end is not. So that end is closed. It's not tensioned very well, but it's closed, and this end is open. And then I did some English rib, which looks like this on one side. No. Tablet that I was talking to it. Looks like this on one side, and this on the other side. And then I did a fisherman's rib, which looks pretty much like single color brioche. I don't know the difference between single color brioche and fisherman's rib. If there is a difference, it might be the same thing. It looks like the same thing to me in my limited brioche experience, but also did that. And these are very easily explained one after another in the user guide that comes with the ribber, so I figured since I'm testing it out, might as well play with it. And then I've got 3 more swatches. This is just a plain rib swatch using some Sport Weight Knit Picks Wool of the Andes, because I do want to do a new Slytherin scarf, and this is the green that I have for the Slytherin scarf, and I was hoping that I could just do a ribbed scarf on this knitting machine, but about halfway through this green swatch, it became very difficult to knit with this yarn. I think it's just too small of a gauge, too grippy of a yarn. I was having to force the carriage, and I'm not going to do that for a sweater. I'm going to break something on the machine if I do that. And I did this at the largest dial setting that you could do on the ribber. The ribber doesn't go all the way to 10 like the machine does, it only goes to 8. So, probably going to be doing a straight stockinette stitch scarf and then seaming it up the side, and seaming each end on the LK150, because I know that that can handle sport weight yarns. If I was doing, I mean, it's possible that I can do straight stockinette with it on the Brother, but I'd rather not risk it. It's kind of too grippy and too thick to really, for me to be comfortable using it on that machine. If it was a slightly lighter sport weight, then I would consider it, but... So there's my test swatch to see how that would work. And then I have re-swatched for this sweater that I haven't worked out any more pattern math on. But I wanted to show you guys that I am working on it slowly. This is the swatch where the dial setting is at 3. The previous sweater I did the dial setting at 2 and it turned out like iron. So this is a 3 and this is a 4. And I think I'm gonna go with the 4. It is a little bit more transparent, a little bit more see-through than the 3, but I do like the fabric that this gives. This one still has a little bit of stiffness, but this is pretty flowing without being completely see-through. So that's probably the one I'm gonna go with. Once I get some more math figured out for that sweater. Which brings us to new stuff. And I have a lot of new stuff to talk about because of the yarn crawl, so bear with me. If you're new to the show, I do not have this much new stuff all the time, but I went on a yarn crawl. And I spent some money. So firstly, just because I was on the yarn crawl, I got this I-91 Shop Hop bag for this year with this little corner pouch thingy again. This little corner pouch thingy basically means it's going to be a little bit loud, but I can stuff the whole bag into the corner and just kind of string it up into a little turnip and have that in a backpack or whatever. And that's just got the logo on it. And I also got a whole slew of patterns that I've shoved into this page protector from just about every shop. There were a couple of shops where I forgot to pick up the pattern, but it's fine. So a bunch of patterns from the shops. That's just part of the passport fee, is they give you a bag if they still have some, because it's a limited quantity of bags, and you get a pattern at every shop you go to. So, that's the basic stuff. Everybody who participates kind of gets that stuff while supplies last. So the first shop I bought from was Village Wool in Glastonbury, Connecticut, which was also the first shop we went into. And I kind of adopted a sweaters quantity. Alright, motorcycle. I adopted a sweaters quantity that needed to come home with me. I found out while on the yarn crawl that Classic Elite Yarns is closing its doors, and they will no longer be in business. I don't know when that whole thing is happening, or if it's already happened, but because of that announcement, Village Wool was having a Classic Elite Yarns yarn sale, and I absolutely love the Classic Elite Yarns Mohawk wool, which is a 60% merino, 30% Romney, 10% nylon wool. So I went and I cleared out what was left of the black, and I grabbed, I think these were the only 3 in this kind of medium gray as well. They were 25% off, so I didn't feel too bad about it, but it was the very first stop of the yarn crawl, and I bought a sweater's quantity of yarn. So it twinged my wallet a little bit, but I couldn't let this yarn be orphaned because I love it so much. So I got about a sweater's quantity of it. First stop. We also went to, I think it was the next stop too. That was, having those 2 stores be our first 2 stops. Yeah, because we went to Webb's, and then we went to Northampton, and then went north. So we went to Webb's, and you always gotta buy in Webb's. You feel weird walking out of Webb's without buying something. Just because it's a wonderful, wonderful giant yarn store. So I knew going to Webb's I wanted to buy some coned yarn. And I saw that they had Harrisville designs on cones, which is a yarn that I know people have used for hand knitting and have enjoyed. It's a toothier yarn. It's kind of rustic. So I went and I got these sport weight cones of blue. So I don't remember how much is on here. Alright, it's 900 yards per cone. So I got 2 cones, and if I need any more sport weight of something, then I'm sure I'll have some black left over from something that I can use in a sweater with this yarn. So, coned yarn. And then while I was poking around in the weaving room, because I get very excited about weaving these days, there was one more of these little end warp shuttles, which is perfect for my 10-inch loom, so that I can use boat shuttles and not have to force a big boat shuttle through a tiny little loom. So I bought another one of these. So that's what I bought at Webb's. These can stay right here. And then we went to Northampton Wools. I didn't buy anything there. And then we went up to Sheep and Shawl in South Deerfield, Massachusetts. And this shop is, their shop birthday is not until later in the year, but they're celebrating, they decided to start celebrating their 5th year of business for the start of the yarn crawl, which is fantastic. So, if you watch Gabby's podcast, Once Upon a Corgi, you'll have seen this stitch marker before, but they're handing out these little wooden sheep stitch markers. Let's see if I can get that to focus. There we go. And they also had these 5-year anniversary tote bags made up. And these are really sturdy tote bags. As soon as both me and Mom picked one up, we were like, I gotta have one of these tote bags. Like, they're really sturdy, and there's a nice size to them. They're not giant, but they're wide, which is really nice. And they have this front pocket. And it's like a really heavy-duty, like, cotton canvas. I'm really pleased with this purchase. So I bought this bag, and I got the stitch marker, and I also found in this shop something I didn't expect to find in this shop, but I found some cotton that I can use for tablet weaving because I was having trouble tensioning the wool and I wanted to try some cotton. So I've got 4 balls of this Nasli Gelin Garden 3 Egyptian Giza mercerized cotton. It's size 3 cotton thread. I have white. I have, does this have a name? This kind of like gold color, red, which is a little bit darker than what's on screen right now, and black. I figured those are good basic colors to use. And I was very impressed with Sheep and Shawl this time around. Last time, it's a lovely little shop, but last time we were struggling to find something new or really interesting to purchase. But their shop has changed a lot in a year since we've been there, and they've really kind of stepped it up in terms of quality stuff in their yarn store and variety of stuff in their yarn store, which was kind of the problem we had last time. So there wasn't a huge variety, but now there's a lot of different stuff, which is why I was surprised to find this cotton in there. But fantastic. I have some weaving cotton to play with. So dump all that in there. And that was it for day 1. And then day 2, we went to, first stop was Green Mountain Spinnery in Putney, Vermont. And I had been carrying around these cards with some clippings of yarn that I wanted to find something that either went with it or matched it. So I had this card with this kind of tealy blue on it, and Green Mountain had this kind of darker tealy blue, which went really nice with this. I don't know yet precisely what it's going to be, but it's easier to figure out something with 3 skeins than 1 skein. So these 2 will go with this 1 skein. This is on their Sock Art Lana 2-ply sock weight in the colorway Noche. And so I bought a couple skeins of that. And then I was pretty much done buying yarn. Oops. Dropping everything. I'd fully anticipated to buy a couple more things, but then I just didn't end up buying any more things while we were out. I didn't find anything that matched my cards, or went with my cards. But I did get one more thing at Margie's Yarn Craft. They were giving away these little wooden tags for the yarn crawl, which is really cool. But those are all my acquisitions from Yarn Crawl. from the I-91 shop hop. But it's a great shop hop, and I totally recommend doing it at least once if you're in the area. Especially if you've never been to any of those stores. I'm gonna sneeze again, damn it. So that was really fun to do. And then I have two more things that I acquired. One of them is a machine, well, both of them are technically machine knitting things, but one of them is definitely a machine knitting thing. And it's in this box, and this is a Suzuki standard gauge garter bar for my, well, it's for any standard gauge Japanese machine, the 4.5mm machines, but this is for use with my brother machine. And it's a pre-owned thing that I got on eBay, because nobody makes these new anymore. And I just thought it was super interesting because of, one, the packaging, but also these were pre-owned by a lady named Rachel at some point, and they have her name on them. So here's a small piece, and they can hook together to make bigger pieces. There is also and these are actually a little bit different from the garter bars that I showed you from Chris Crafter for the LK150. There's these, see those like needle eye holes? Those go over the hooks, so you can slide your knitting onto this, and then when you turn it around, this side has these little channels so that you can feed the hooks through the little channels under the loops of the yarn so you can catch them, which is a little different from the Chris Crafter's ones. So I've got these 3 pieces, and this one has a join on it, so I could join these 2 together, or I could join these 2 together for the full length of the machine. And also, there's a couple of other things in here. I'm not sure what these little clippies are used for, but there's these little clippies in here with this ring. I don't know what that's for. And there's also the needle covers. You can put these on your machine. This end is facing you, so that when you're feeding the yarn on and off the needles, your needles won't move anywhere, which is helpful if you're doing a very large project. So I bought that because a garter bar is really, really handy to have if you're a machine knitter. Not only can you do garter stitch with it, but if you're doing decreases like with those hats, where you're doing decreases kind of like in the middle of the knitting, you can take everything off, remove the needles you don't need, and put it back on so you're not just shifting everything over a couple stitches at a time, which is brilliant. So I bought the garter bar, and I also bought a bench for my craft room. I'm not going to show it to you. It's a bench. It's an IKEA bench. You can find it. But while I've been working on these shawl shapes projects, I've really been noticing that when I'm using the full bed of the knitting machine, it's really hard to do manipulations on either end comfortably because I have to lean over, which is not too much of a problem, but you know, since I've had this inflammation in my hands, I've been really conscious about not putting my body through stresses it doesn't need to have. Like, don't hunch over things so that you hurt your back. Don't do that kind of stuff. So, I figured a bench that's about the width of the knitting machine would be great, because I could just slide across without leaning over. It also doesn't put any weird directional pressure on the needles, so that I can still do the manipulation on this side, slide over, do the manipulation on this side without kind of pulling the needles in while I'm manipulating the stitches, if that makes sense. So I now have a bench down there, which is why this chair is in here. And those pillows that were on the chairs are up here now because they just fell out of the other chair. And this chair, I only needed one for this chair. So now they're in my computer chair, is what I'm getting at. Alright. I'll try to wrap it up. I know I filmed 3 segments already, and that's usually an hour and a half. Oh, but I've got a lot of stuff to talk about in other stuff. So, if you're done with crafting, see ya. I've got other stuff to talk about. So, stuff I'm watching. I have been watching Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown on Netflix since the news of his suicide. It was a show that I wanted to watch and just hadn't gotten to it, and I figured now's the time to do it, just because it's on my mind and it's a tragic thing. So I've been watching that show, and it's a really fascinating show, kind of food and culture show, and it's really, really cool to see places that people don't usually go. So I've been watching that. I've been listening to a fair bit since I've been able to wear headphones at work again. I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and just like marathoning through a lot of podcasts because I love podcasts. So here we go, stuff I've been listening to. I started listening to a podcast called Our Fair City, which is in its final season now. Here's the blurb. Our Fair City is an online audio play / podcast set in a future dystopian version of Hartford, Connecticut. Following a climate change-related disaster, humanity is now confined to subterranean cities. HeartLife, an insurance company, now runs the lives of all policies in the city. Lightning rigs high above the city gather energy from thunderstorms, mad scientists walk the earth, and adorably monstrous mole people dig tunnels deep underground to expand the city's habitable space. Framed as true dramatizations of our city's glorious history, Our Fair City is equal parts camp, sci-fi horror, and folktale. So listen and remember. It's great. It's doubly great because I didn't realize that they actually meant Hartford, Connecticut until like season 3 or 4. Because Hartford's not an uncommon name for a city. Anywhere where deer were once common kind of has a Hartford, I think. It's not that uncommon, but it's super great, and I get double the amount of chuckle out of it because I've been listening to it in Hartford, Connecticut, and it's about future Hartford. So, super awesome. Then I've been listening to Freed. Freed is a radio drama podcast detailing the ramifications a worldwide pandemic has on people and the world as a whole, told through bi-weekly updates from the cozy yet abandoned mountain town of Freed. Learn more about the town's history, the fall of humanity, and how to help rebuild society. In the meantime, be safe, be strong, be alive. That's kind of her catchphrase. I really am enjoying that podcast. It was kind of slow to get into for me personally, but I'm really enjoying where it's going. Yeah, I'm really enjoying where it's going. I had a good weekend just kind of listening to it while I was weaving. So that's cool. Also have been listening to Subject Found. Subject Found is a bi-weekly audio drama. Each new season will feature a new subject, a new story, a new monster. In season 2, Janice Herring pursues the monster terrorizing Memphis, Tennessee, and the story will make her a legend. To get the kind of idea of this podcast, season 1 is about a guy documenting his hunt for Bigfoot. And season 2 is this journalist, and she's following a case about serial murders in Tennessee. And there's a monster involved, and I haven't quite figured it out yet. But there's some really interesting twists in season 2, and season 2 kind of jumps up in production value from season 1, so that's very exciting. And if I'm not mistaken, Subject Found is written by a guy who is part of a kind of a similar strata of audio drama podcasts where they like to promote each other, and that's actually a really good way to hear about some new podcasts you might not have heard before. I think there's a couple of these podcasts that I've mentioned are ones that during the credits or the outros will recommend another podcast that they're also a fan of or who they've worked with before. So that's pretty cool. It might be this podcast, it might be a different podcast. I don't really remember, but definitely one of these podcasts in these lists does that, and it's pretty awesome. And it's something I kind of miss about podcasts, is people promoting each other's podcasts consistently. Anyway, I also just finished up The Walk, a thriller in which you, the listener, are the hero. The Walk begins in Inverness Station, Scotland. Through a case of mistaken identity, you, the walker, are given a vital package that must be couriered to Edinburgh. But as you're about to board the train, terrorists blow it up and set off an electromagnetic pulse. None of the cars or trains are working. You'll have to walk. But now the terrorists are on your trail because they want the device you're carrying, and the police are after you as a suspect in the bombing. To survive, you'll have to join up with other escapees from the city. But how many of them can you trust? And are they really who they say they are? This one is really, really great. It does a great job of making you the central character, without it being kind of too much of a gimmick. It really flows well, since your character never talks, because it could be anybody. And it's really great. It kind of takes a really interesting kind of Mission Impossible, not quite as extreme as Mission Impossible, but like a sci-fi Mission Impossible type action podcast. It's really great, and I definitely recommend it if you're into kind of mystery action storytelling. I've also been listening, I got 2 more podcasts. The Tunnels podcast. The Tunnels is a serialized audio drama about the mysterious tunnels that can be found underneath a small town in Georgia. What are they? What is their history? What are those mysterious sounds heard within them? Find out what's just below the surface of the town, because if you look underneath, there is so much more. I'm really enjoying the premise of this podcast. It's a little rougher than some of the other podcasts. The audio quality is not professional grade, which is perfectly fine, especially since it fits in with this kind of investigative guy looking into a weird thing in a town type of podcast storytelling. It's similar to the type of storytelling that's found in Subject Found, in Tanis and the Black Tapes, the kind of mockumentary style. But I'm really interested to see where it will go, and it does improve throughout. You can really see the guy who writes this, like, improving as a writer, seeing an improvement in the acting and the sound quality, and it's really kind of cool to be a part of that almost real time. There's not a whole lot of episodes of The Tunnels, but it's one of those things that I, as a creator, like to be a part of, to encourage that creativity of somebody else. So, but I definitely recommend it. It is really interesting about these tunnels. There's like cults and creatures and pyromaniacs. It's really, really interesting. And then I also listened to Station, A handful of fading memories, the remains of a research project, and a garbled tape recorder are all Dr. Miranda Kwan has to her name when her research partner goes missing on the eve of a 10-week ocean expedition. Now she must try to find closure in the midst of a rapidly unraveling conspiracy, surrounded by a handful of unlikely allies, several likely threats, and the icy waters of the North Pacific. Something sinister lurks in the heart of the research ship Astrid, and Miranda must rely on her wits to piece together an answer. Station to Station is a sci-fi horror audio drama about loss, memory, morality, and what gets left behind. This one's really interesting because of the mystery. It's a little bit fragmented, but once you start to put the pieces together, you get that rush of, I'm figuring it out, and I really, really enjoyed this one. Which is basically what I had to say about all of them, but you should definitely check any of those out if they sound interesting to you. So just a couple things in stuff I'm reading. I started reading a book called All Out, The No Longer Secret Stories of Queer Teens Throughout the Ages. The author's listed as Sandra Mitchell on Amazon, which is where I bought it. But it's a short story collection, and here's the blurb. Take a journey through time and genres to discover stories where queer teens live, love, and shape the world around them. 17 young adult authors across the queer spectrum have come together to create a collection of beautifully written, diverse historical fiction for teens. From a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood set in war-torn 1870s Mexico featuring a transgender soldier, to two girls falling in love while mourning the death of Kurt Cobain, forbidden love in a 16th century Spanish convent, or an asexual girl discovering her identity amid the 1970s roller disco scene, All Out tells a diverse range of stories across cultures, time periods, and identities, shedding light on an area of history often ignored or forgotten. I bought this book on a Saturday morning, and I flew through half of it before I had to get up and start the day. It is a really, really good collection of queer fiction. It's really, really fantastic. Especially stuff like that retelling of Little Red Riding Hood in war-torn 1870s Mexico. That's like everything I love about fiction all at once. It was really fantastic. I think it's worth checking out for anybody. I think there's types of stories in there that are for everyone. So definitely go pick it up, and I look forward to reading the rest of it. And then I have 3 fanfics to talk about. I've read a lot more than that because it's been a month, but I actually managed to pull a theme out of some fics. So I'm going to talk about 3 fanfics featuring missing persons from Harry Potter. So the first one I'm going to talk about is a collection called The Library of Elvish Lore by Evan Sentrenst. I'm not sure how you pronounce that name. And here's the blurb from the first part, which is the part that really kind of draws you in. Harry is an elf. No, he's not a bloody house elf. He lived in a place where they had got him confused with a house elf for nearly 6 years. They had him doing all the chores, and he slept in a cupboard. Not a particularly cheerful cupboard, either. But he is not a house elf. He's a regular elf, thank you. Come on, people. It's like you're not wizards or something. Pre-Hogwarts. Not a creature fic, meaning it's Harry's still human. And then also in the blurb it says character study. So yeah, there's 3 parts to this. The first part is pre-Hogwarts, and then the next 2 are kind of during and around Hogwarts. And basically, when Harry's 6, he gets left behind on a company picnic. Vernon and Petunia bring him to the picnic, and they do not bring him home. And while he's wandering around homeless, living in the forest, he finds that he can do things. He can disappear in places. He can sometimes create a little bit of fire. He can keep himself warm sometimes. So, being the bright young lad of 6 he is, he must be a forest elf. And so, he's in the forest, living as a forest elf, learning how to survive, and granting boons to humans. So he'll come up to a farm and, like, he'll meet the you know, a 10-year-old girl who lives there, and he's like, I can grant you a boon if you have a wish that you want granted. And she'll wish for confidence. And he'll make her an amulet, and unknowingly, using his accidental magic, you know, kind of basically give her a good luck charm or something that'll help her feel confident when she's scared, and it works. And he trades boons for food or clothing or whatever he needs. As a child. And it's a fantastic fic. It's a fantastic sort of in-universe kid logic. It's probably the best kid logic fic I've ever read. Like, Harry sees something or experiences something he can't explain. He finds an explanation for it. Obviously, the Dursleys didn't like me because I wasn't a human. I was a forest elf the whole time. And it's especially great once he starts meeting wizards, because he thinks their logic is bonkers, which it is in the Harry Potter universe. They don't have very much common sense. And it's especially great because he'll be talking to snakes and they'll be like, what's the wizard doing? And he'll explain it and they'll be like, that doesn't make any sense. And he's like, obviously, that doesn't make any sense. And it's great to see this, like, weird elf child, Harry, interacting with, like, Hermione, who thinks he's crazy, and Hagrid, and Snape. That's especially entertaining. And surprisingly, Flitwick. I really like their interactions in this fic. Highly recommend it. It's great. And then there's a fic, Running on Air by 11D7. Draco Malfoy has been missing for 3 years. Harry is assigned the cold case and finds himself slowly falling in love with the memories he collects. This is a sort of, you know, finding yourself while you're looking for someone else type of fix, but it's really, really well done, and I think it's especially interesting to follow that kind of narrative thread in the Harry Potter universe, since they can preserve memories and allow other people to see them. So, like, while Harry is trying to puzzle out where Malfoy could have gone, he's collecting memories from Astoria, from Narcissa, from shopkeepers. Like, it's really, really interesting, especially kind of dealing with that post-Wizarding War, what was happening with the purebloods, what was happening with Muggleborns, the kind of politics around that, and how others were perceived, and how Harry was in the middle of it. It's really an interesting fic. And then the last one I'm going to recommend is Hermione Granger's Hogwarts Grammar for Delinquents on the Run by Wasp Abi. You're a wizard, Harry, is easier to hear from a half-giant when you're 11, rather than from some kids on a tube platform when you're 17 and late for work. So this is an alternate year 7, where Harry never got his letter, and he never went to Hogwarts. He left the Dursleys as soon as he could, living rough or living on couches in London, working odd jobs, selling trinkets on the streets, eating out of dumpsters, squatting in old buildings. But year 7 is when Voldemort's return takes over the Ministry. The other kids in the Harry Potter universe pretty much follow the same things that happened in the books, except for Draco Malfoy, who decided, no, being a Death Eater is not for me, thanks. So he, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, Neville, and Luna don't go to that year of schooling. But Hermione's got all the books, so they can continue their schooling while they're on the run. And they go looking for Harry Potter, because they know that Voldemort's going to start looking for Harry Potter. And if he's still out there somewhere, they cannot let Voldemort find him. So it's really, really interesting for this, like, cynical, street smart, wisecracking Harry Potter to start learning magic and how it doesn't make any sense half the time from these kids on the run from Death Eaters, while he's teaching them how to survive in the Muggle world so that they don't get hit by a bus. It's really fantastic. And I'm probably going to reread it soon, because it's, sometimes I just think about it and I'm like, it's so good. It's so good. Especially wisecracking Harry, and like, he kind of pulls a Tonks and like dyes his hair different colors. It's really, really great. It's a great fic. Highly recommended. So that's going to do it for this episode, finally, after a bajillion hours. So, show notes and links for everything that you might want to check out is going to be over at freakishlemon.com or freakishlemonpodcast.com. Check out the make-alongs over on Ravelry. Just search Freakish Lemon in the Groups tab. You can follow me as Freakish Lemon at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry if you're interested in that kind of thing. And the links to all those things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. So that's going to do it for me. Time to shut up now. Goodbye.